Welcome back to Washington Journal. For about the next 45 minutes, we're going to be talking about industrial hemp. And with us to explain what that is and why there's a controversy over it is Robert McGinnis. He is the Vice President for Policy of the Family Research Council. Thanks very much for coming in this morning.
Thank you, George.
And Eric Steenstra. He is President of Vote Hemp. And Eric, why don't you start us off and tell us what is industrial hemp and why is there a controversy over it?
Industrial hemp is an incredibly versatile crop. A lot of different products can be made from it. The controversy that I believe we're here to talk about this morning is about the hemp seed, which is being used for food products and cosmetics. And the DEA decided that because the hemp seed contains trace infinitesimal amounts of THC in it, that they wanted to ban the hemp seed product, even though it's clearly exempted under federal law.
First of all, what's THC?
Tetrahydrocannabinol, which is the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana.
And hemp and marijuana are cousins?
That's correct. From the same genus, from the same species of the plant.
Now, is hemp psychoactive? I mean,
Absolutely not. There's no way you can get high from industrial hemp.
Even though it has some THC in it?
It has very small, minute trace amounts of THC in it. For example, in the plant, in the growing plant, in marijuana, you would have 5 to maybe 30%, as much as 30% THC in it, whereas industrial hemp crops grown in Canada or Europe would have 0.3% THC in the plant. And then when you take it to the seed, the amount that's in there, we're talking about a few parts per million at the most.
Okay, I want to ask Bob McGinnis why there's a controversy, but why don't we just take a quick look here? This is the kind of thing we're talking about. If we can get this under the camera here, this is Ruth's Hemp Tortilla Chips. Why make tortilla chips with hemp, by the way?
Well, there's nutritional benefits with the hemp seed. It contains essential fatty acids, omega-3 and omega-6 essential fatty acids, which are very good for health. A lot of nutritionists are now recommending them. There are other sources, but hemp has a really good balance of omega-3 and omega-6 essential fatty acids. So it's an excellent source for that.
It's the same kind of thing you get from eating salmon and
exactly, or other seeds.
Bob McGinnis. Why is there controversy over this? This sounds, from what Eric Steenstra was telling us, is that it'd be fairly benign stuff.
Yeah. Well, there's an interpretive rule that's in the Federal Register that Eric's talking about that DEA said, look, we went to the Controlled Substance Act and we looked in there and it says that THC is a controlled substance. Well, and it makes no distinction whether or not it's point whatever or 30%. That THC is illegal. They go in this particular interpretive rule and they provide some exemptions. And so you can do certain things. You can make rope, clothing, and so forth. However, they say that, because it's in food, they believe that they can exclude it. They can make it illegal. Therefore, they gave them 120 days grace and you had to do away with it. Well, some of Eric's friends, I'm sure, went to the Ninth Circuit and they filed a petition saying, look, they're a violation of what they call the Administrative Procedures Act and some other procedural problems with that. And frankly, that's going to be resolved in the courts. My concern, at least one of a number, George, is that our FDA hasn't determined whether or not THC as a food ingredient is safe or not. In fact, I've sent a letter, as many others have, to DEA and the FDA and say, look, you need to look at this because we've looked at the science, and the science says THC has some real problems. The Institute of Medicine, certainly the Surgeon General, and so forth. So if there's a safety issue, we ought to know as Americans that what we're eating in these chips or whatever is not going to accumulate over time, because we know the half-life of THC in our system can be from 20 hours to 14 days and then stay in there for over a month perhaps. And the science suggests if you're smoking to get THC in your system, it's going to have some terrible effects, and it's not just because of the smoke. It's perhaps because of the THC or the other 66 or 65 cannabinoids. There are a lot of unanswered questions, and that's my concern about the safety of food, at least initially.
What are the harmful effects you're talking about?
Well,
THC?
There's a host of science. If you go into the 1999 report by the Institute of Medicine, this was commissioned by the drug czar, and you look and see all the science they review. They talk about, for instance, that it disrupts short-term memory, that it impacts the immunosystem, that it inhibits the reproductive functions. These are all in this particular report.
But these are all studies on using smoking THC,
But Eric,
trace amounts.
But it addresses the presence of THC. I could go into the smoking ingredient. There are 400 and plus different compounds in crude marijuana, but I'm talking about THC here, and they talk specifically. It can be used, quote, as a medicine in some contexts, but others it has an impact. So is it safe? Is it accumulating in our bodies? Is it safe? And we need a decision on that.
Let me just invite our callers, our listeners, and our viewers to call in. If you are for the legal production, use of industrial hemp, I invite you to call in at 202-585-3880. We've got those numbers up on the screen now. If you're against it, if you're anti-hemp legalization, 202-585-3881. Bob McGinnis, quick, and then Eric Steenstra, both of you, give me a sense of what's going to happen with this court case. Right now, this whole issue is in abeyance because the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals out in San Francisco is considering it. What's going to happen?
The Ninth Circuit has a reputation for getting its cases overturned by the Supreme Court. So I expect the Ninth Circuit's going to rule against the DEA, and then the Supreme Court will ultimately reverse that.
All right, Eric?
Well, we do think that the Ninth Circuit will rule in favor of the hemp industry and against the DEA based on the merits of the case. It's pretty clear. If you look at federal law, hemp is clearly exempted. It says, you know, marijuana is this, and the industrial hemp is exempted, and the DEA is trying to now say that it's somehow covered because of THC. Well, the THC definition clearly also says, unless specifically accepted, and then it goes in, and then it talks about THC as synthetic form. So THC was already covered under marijuana. If Congress fully intended to exempt the hemp seed when they did so, and they understood that it had trace amounts of resin on it when they had their hearings, and it wasn't a concern. They understood it couldn't be abused. It's not being abused. Nobody's manufacturing these products, you know, to be used to get high. There's no, and DEA has not presented any evidence, or anybody else that I'm aware of, any evidence that these products are unsafe. In fact, the industry's done its own studies, and we've established a program called Test Pledge. You can find it on the internet at testpledge.com, and it establishes science-based levels for THC in hemp products, in hemp food products and cosmetics, that absolutely guarantee that they're safe and also that they won't cause a false positive on a drug test, on a confirmed positive drug test.
Let me just ask you real quick before we do that, and I want to get your response on that, but how big an industry are we talking about here before we...
The hemp industry, in its complete industry, is about $150 million in the United States. The food and cosmetics part of it, which is what this rule addresses, is about $40 million.
Okay, Bob McGinnis, you wanted to respond to that?
Now, we need to be very careful about listening to the hemp industry scientists. You know, keep in mind, in '54 and all the way up until the last few years, we were listening to the tobacco industry. They have a vested financial interest, as Eric just pointed out. So if we want to present, and there's an opportunity in the Federal Register, if you want to present scientific evidence, you go out there and you do double-blind experiments, you get peer-reviewed scientists that to look at the the studies, and then they come out with a good study. I would recommend perhaps the Institute of Medicine to look at that
study. That's not about THC.
I'm suggesting that you go to the Institute of Medicine and you say, look, do a study on this, find out if the THC in hemp is in fact safe, and if it is, then you declare, much like they did in this study.
Well, let me call a time out here, and let's get our callers into this thing here. We're going to have plenty of time to hash this over. Dillon Beach, California, on the pro-hemp legalization line. Go right ahead.
Yes, good morning. Hi. In regards to Mr. McGinnis's comments on the safety and studies of THC, number one, I'd like to point out that there are plenty of studies on THC that he can go to, probably at the University of Montana or the University of New Mexico, that are long-term, that go into many effects of THC on the body, and that's from ingesting it. And as far as its safety, I'd like to know why the government is so interested in using hemp in food and so concerned about our safety when we've already had genetically modified foods. We've had nitrates that are proven to cause cancer in our foods for a very, very long time. Aspartame. We have many, many substances in our food that we don't know whether they're safe or not, but they are very, very legal.
Caller, quick question. Those studies you're referring to, what do they conclude?
They concretely conclude that now I'm not talking about hemp, I'm talking about basically medicinal cannabis, that it is, over long-term studies, been proven to be very safe.
Okay. All right. Let's get Bob McGinnis's response to that.
There are a lot of ingredients we ought to be looking at that unfortunately haven't been looked at the FDA. That's first. Yeah, there are a lot of studies out there. National Institute of Drug Abuse has been collecting them down at the University of Mississippi for years, thousands and thousands. The vast majority show that there is some problem with cannabis, but also with the THC. There was a study that is still to be published, but we have a draft copy out of Canada, Health Canada, HHS of Canada, and they conclude, after having legalized hemp and using it in food products back in 1998, that there are some risk associated, health risk, developmental health risks, and so forth. So they're saying, look, you know, we probably went too far. 10 parts per million, that's too much, they say, perhaps. We ought to reduce it or eliminate it totally. And yet, you know, here's a study out of the Journal of Analytical Toxicology. It says, you really, out of seeds, because of the processing, it's very, very difficult to remove all the THC. So we really need to go back to the safety issue. Are we getting all the THC out of it? Therefore, if we aren't, is there a problem with that for our health?
Okay, Eric.
Yeah,
Eric Steenstra from Vote Hemp.
3 points that I'd like to make. First off, with respect to the study, the industry study that the test pledge program is based on. This is a study that was published in the Journal of Analytical Toxicology in the November-December 2001 issue. It was also co-authored by a researcher who works for the government, Dr. El Soli, works for the government in University of Mississippi. So this is not a questionable study that was somehow produced by the hemp industry, you know, in biased way. It was peer-reviewed and published, and it's good science. Secondly, Mr. McGinnis mentioned the fact that the DEA was looking for comments on the rule, and that's true. In fact, the DEA received 115,000 comments from the public. I went down and personally reviewed those comments. There wasn't a single one there opposing the rule. In fact, the Family Research Council did not submit any comments to the DEA under that comment period. The final point I'd like to make with regard to this so-called Health Canada report, that was a draft that was produced by another organization. It was never released by Health Canada, and it's not been approved or signed off on by Health Canada. So it's clear that if they thought that there was a big issue here, a health or safety issue, they would have done something about it.
Okay, our next call comes from Hollywood, Florida, on the anti-hemp legalization line. Good morning.
Good morning. I'd like to just kind of comment and ask one question. Basically, I feel that if drugs worked, everybody'd be using them. So they don't work. One question I have is there any connection, which I had heard coming out of NIH, about the effects of smoking marijuana and attention deficit disorder? I guess parents that were smoking a lot of marijuana in the 60s.
Actually, caller, we're trying to sort of orient this toward the hemp idea, and at least from what I can understand, we're not talking about marijuana here. We may get into that, but do you have a question? How in your mind does hemp and marijuana connect here?
Well, isn't it the same plant?
Okay, let's ask Eric Steenstra. That's a good question.
It's the same species, but it's not the same plant. It's grown differently. It has vastly different levels of THC, and in fact, industrial hemp also has another cannabinoid called CBD in it, which acts to counteract the effects. If you went out to a hemp field and you picked out leaves off the plant and smoked them, you would not get high.
Let me just throw this out here. This is something in Time Magazine, in doing the research for this. Here's a line in Time Magazine, and I'll get Bob McGinnis to comment on this too. Marijuana will typically have anywhere from 3% to 20% THC. That's the active psychoactive ingredient. Hemp is bred to contain less than 1%. Eric Steenstra, you say about 0.3%. You could roll and smoke every leaf on a 15-foot hemp plant and gain little more than a hacking cough.
That's a bit of an exaggeration. It's interesting over the years. 69, I was not too far from Woodstock at West Point going to school, but you know, the THC in the marijuana smoked at Woodstock was relatively low, almost like it is today with hemp in some cases. Certainly some of the young soldiers over the years that I've arrested for possession of marijuana, it graded out at very low, below 1% THC. So you can find that in hemp. It's interesting, Eric mentioned, in fact, I gave Asa Hutchinson this article that I wrote, Hemp is Marijuana, Should Farmers Grow It? And also to the drug czar. So we were very active. I didn't feel after that I needed to provide comment after I provided this. And also on the motivational enhancement issues, I am concerned about kids. HHS has come up with a very good study about the impact of all this, not only hemp, but obviously mostly cannabis is smoked on kids. So, you know, this is sending I think, a mixed message to our children. Safety first, but also the mixed messages in a drug that's mostly abused in this country by a lot of our kids.
Let's go to Naperville, Illinois on the anti-hemp legalization line. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm calling to say that I am very concerned about our children and what a hemp has, how it can affect them. What I know from working in drug prevention is I have talked to a young man, not so young anymore. He served 2 prison sentences in Indiana federal prison. And when he found out after the first time that he got out of prison that there was a hemp field growing wild in a state park close by, he went out and harvested the hemp and combined it with other marijuana in some instances, and then in other instances sold it alone, rolled it up, and sold it to his customers. And as he indicated, he never had any complaints from his customers. What we know from the early or late 60s is that they were actually, the marijuana that they were smoking oftentimes at that particular time was 0.3%. Now, they might have smoked more than one joint, but they were still smoking it and they were still getting high.
Okay. Eric Steenstra, you want to take that one?
Well, the statistics that the Drug Enforcement Administration has on the hemp that was seized in the 60s does not show that it was 0.3%, number one. Number two, hemp's been grown in Europe for decades, and they don't have any problems like this. I mean, for example, in France, which is a very strong prohibition country where they don't allow marijuana cultivation, they've been growing hemp there for decades. And they haven't had any problems at all with people going out and stealing marijuana out of the fields. I mean, people find out very quickly this is not psychoactive. You know, it does, like I said, it has such a small amount of THC in it, you can't get high from it. And in addition to that, it has this CBD in it, which counteracts the effects of marijuana.
CBD?
Yeah, it's cannabidiol. It's another cannabinoid, but it counteracts the effects of marijuana.
Let's let our viewers and our listeners know exactly where you guys are both coming from. What is Vote Hemp?
Vote Hemp is an education and public advocacy group working to change the laws in the United States to allow farmers to grow hemp and to allow the industry to continue to grow.
Funded by?
Funded by donations from private individuals who are interested in seeing something happen with us.
Who are your biggest supporters?
Biggest supporters? Dr. Bronner's Magic Soaps is one company that has supported us a lot. We have a lot of individual contributions from a lot of smaller companies.
Does Dr. Bronner use hemp in his products?
Yes, in their hemp soaps.
Okay, and Bob McGinnis, Family Research Council?
501c3 nonprofit promoting what we think are good values for families across America. We're funded by individuals all across the country, not any one group or whatever, and we don't promote any particular merchandise either. We promote solid family values. If I can respond perhaps to what was said a moment ago, I'd like to do that, George. The UN's International Narcotics Control Board said the following about Switzerland. Now, I go to Switzerland at least once a year to work on the drug issue, so I know it, and I've probably gone there 20 times over the last couple of decades. There are disturbing indications that fields where cannabis with a low THC content is allegedly cultivated for industrial purposes are in fact used for the cultivation of more potent cannabis destined for the illicit market. They estimate 100 tons of cannabis for smoking purposes is going out of those hemp fields. And I've seen those hemp fields personally. I've been in the hemp stores. I've seen personally and talked to the purveyors. So this is a problem. It's not just in Switzerland. It's also in France, also in Germany. And so I think that we need to be very careful about making categorical, allegations that we can't really support, that are certainly disagreed by the United Nations.
Quick question, Bob McGinnis. And first of all, tell us this. I got off your website. This
Sure.
is hemp marijuana. Hemp is marijuana. Should farmers grow it? This
Right.
is a lengthy paper that, and there it is. There.
So I gave the DEA.
You can get it. You can either, I think, write in and get it, or you can get it off your website.
FRC.org.
FRC.org. And one of the things I think it says in here, it says somewhere, forgive me if it's not in here, is that if you grow industrial hemp with regular marijuana, there's cross-pollination, and the regular marijuana gets less potent.
Well, clearly it's going to pollinate. Most industrial hemp is grown close together, but if you grow it for seeds, it's grown a number of feet apart, much like you would grow cannabis for smoking. So, if you're going to seek out the seeds, then you're going to have other plants perhaps that are planted in there that have a much higher THC, and yeah, they do cross-pollinate, and you can't control from one generation to the next all that well.
Okay, let's get New York City on the hemp legalization line. Good morning.
Good morning. God bless C-SPAN. I am a marijuana smoker. I just smoked last night. I'm calling this morning. I'm a proud American. This man scares me to death, Mr. McGinnis. I'd like to tell him to maybe investigate the trace elements of nicotine in nicotine. Examine the trace elements of alcohol in alcohol. He says he's for solid family values. Go after those people. Also, the Journal of Toxicology. I'm sure they have plenty of research on the great family value that is legalized alcohol. And also, I'd like to inform Mr. McGinnis that our founding fathers had hemp. They could use it. So you should learn a few things from our founding fathers if you want to be a proud American.
Caller, quick question: Does the legalization of hemp help with the legalization of marijuana? Are the two linked in your mind?
They're not linked, but according to this man, Mr. McGinnis, they are very linked, and I'm very happy that you point out to him, and that you must continue to point out to him through the course of his appearance here, that there is a great distinction between hemp and marijuana, and the trace elements that he is just completely laughable. Trace elements, that's ridiculous.
Okay, thanks, caller. This is something, and Bob McGinnis, I want to give you a shot, but this is something I know from reading the paper in the Family Research Council that said that this is a stalking horse, that hemp is a stalking horse for the legalization of marijuana. Is there any...
You know, I'm sure there's people that are advocating for the legalization of marijuana who also advocate for industrial hemp, but does that mean that it's a bad idea, that we shouldn't do it? That's, you know, my point is there's no way. I mean, the people that are advocating for industrial hemp are clearly advocating for its industrial uses. If you go to our website, votehemp.com, take a look at it. Tell me if, you know, you can see clearly what our interest is. You can see what these products are. Does this look like something that people are going to get high on? You know, Roots Chips or Alf Snack Bar, the Nature's Path Organic Hemp Plus Granola. These are not, you know, this is not about drugs.
All right, I think we do have the website. We may have shown it already. We've got a couple of websites at votehemp.com. I think we can, there it is. And I believe we also, Bob McGinnis, you said it's frc.org. There it is, the Family Research Council. You can get a lot more information on this topic at both those websites. And Bob McGinnis, you want a quick response to that last caller?
The leading pro-marijuana magazine in this country is High Times. If you go in throughout, and I've been subscribing for years, interestingly, because I follow the movement, you find hemp advertisements. You know, here's an interesting one I just made a Xerox of, 100% hemp. Now, that's a joint. You can't necessarily say that that's marijuana inside, but it certainly looks like a joint. And it's advertising paper made of hemp, and it's been advertised in this magazine, High Times. These people, when you have Hemp Fest around the country, what happens at a Hemp Fest? Smoke marijuana. They wear these shirts that say, I'm a pothead. Those sorts of things. So yes, they've perhaps, as Eric suggests, have co-opted this issue. But the kids have not lost sight of that. You ask Speaker Hassard on the Hill. He'll say, look, there are two issues that are promoting decriminalization, legalization of marijuana in this country. Industrial hemp and also medical marijuana. So they're linked by the subculture, whether the hemp industry wants that or not.
Okay, Falls Church, Virginia, on the anti-legalization line. Good morning.
Good morning, and I want to welcome Bob McGinnis. I think he's a wonderful voice for common sense. I called to say, and you all are just discussing it now, that there is a tremendous link between marijuana and hemp. You had told a caller, we're talking about hemp, we're not talking about marijuana, but you are. Every time you talk about hemp, that's exactly what you're talking about. And it is the line of the legalization, the marijuana legalization forces who want to pretend that there's a separation between hemp and marijuana. I don't believe there is. I believe we've got plenty of natural resources in this country to make whatever products we want. We don't need this dangerous door opened. I think it would be a tremendous mistake, and I can't imagine a better illustration of why we should not legalize marijuana than that poor fellow who just called in from New York.
Okay.
So good luck, Bob McGinnis.
All right, Eric Steenstra, let me get you to respond to that caller.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to point out something else. You know, they're asserting here that you know, industrial hemp food products somehow promote the use of marijuana. Would they also then assert that the use of a poppy seed bagel or a poppy seed muffin promotes the use of heroin. I don't think that's, that's not realistic. And the DEA hasn't asserted that either. And it's interesting that poppy seeds have the edible poppy seeds have the exact same exemption that industrial hemp has under federal statutes, and the DEA hasn't come after poppy seeds in any way. Nobody seems, Mr. McGinnis doesn't seem to be concerned about poppy seeds either. So,
well, I think it's a non-germane argument. We're talking about THC and cannabis today, not about heroin or cocaine or many of the other illicit drugs in this country.
Is there any legitimacy to the argument that poppy seeds contain the ingredient that leads to heroin?
I think that you can make the same arguments that Eric's making, but the fact is we've gone through extensive science over the years. We've looked at each of these substances, and in fact, just last year, the DEA went through the rescheduling question on THC. The Surgeon General was very straightforward on all the science, saying, look, this is not good stuff unless it's used under proper conditions. And you do have THC that's available in a pill produced by a company in the Midwest.
Salt Lake City, Utah, on the hemp legalization line. Good morning.
Hello. I would like to address this to the man I'm looking at right now with the comb over. His body language speaks volumes. I would like to tell you, sir, that I'm 57 years old. I've been smoking marijuana for 25 years. I defended your country in the United States Navy. Did you go in the United States Armed Forces to defend your country?
Right here.
Okay.
Caller, got one more question for our guest?
Colonel. And I want to tell you that I've been smoking marijuana as long as I told you, and I have worked for the United States government for 38 years, and I have done my job commendably. What have you done? Goodbye.
Well, it's interesting. I do these sort of venues on a frequent basis, George, and they don't help themselves, those that want to decriminalize marijuana, by going and making ad hominem attacks like that. We need to look at the science. The science is very compelling. I don't want to dismiss what the science says. In fact, I want to go to the FDA and say, look, you give us the truth about this. I don't want the hemp industry doing it. I want an independent organization to say whether or not this is healthy food. Is THC that's going to get into our system, no matter how little, is it going to have an impact? I think we need to pursue that.
Lafargeville, New York, on the anti-hemp legalization line. Good morning.
Hi. I'm an airline pilot, and I think that there's so many different professions that shouldn't be using that. And it's how do you protect the public when you legalize the drug? How do you protect the public from surgeons using it, or pilots using it, or bus drivers using it, or train operators? Every time there's a train wreck, they find somebody who's been smoking that stuff. So I'm definitely against it.
Caller, let me just try to bring you back. But is there any distinction in your mind between?
No, absolutely not. I mean, the organization is trying to regulate. They're trying to bring in hemp legalization. Is just a baseline for bringing in marijuana.
Okay, thanks. Eric Steenstra?
Well, he's entitled to his opinion, but I respectfully disagree with him. Like I said, these products are not about legalizing marijuana. You can take one look at them. You can taste them. They're delicious. They're nutritious, and they're useful products. There's nothing on these products that says, legalize marijuana, use these products to get high or anything like that. That's not what they're intended for, and I understand there's people out there with strong feelings on the marijuana issue, but
Now, the one thing I want to ask both of you, I found here that under the DEA regulation, the proposed regulation, some products would still be legal, others would not. The ones that would be illegal is anything that goes into the body. That means, according to the DEA's own website, beer, cheese, coffee, corn chips, energy drinks, flour, ice cream, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the potato chips and then the products we've got here on the table here on the set. But things that would be legal would be, and this may come as a surprise to some people that this stuff is made from hemp, birdseed mixture containing sterilized cannabis seed, clothing including hats, shirts, and shoes, cosmetics, lotion, paper, rope, twine, yarn, shampoo, and soap. Where does the hemp come from that it goes into these products? Is it imported? Is it grown legally in the United States?
It's not grown legally in the United States unless you have a DEA license. There is one program in Hawaii where they are growing a test crop of industrial hemp under DEA license. Most of the hemp, almost all the hemp that's imported into the United States either comes from Canada or from Europe or from China or Eastern Europe. All those countries, all of the European Union, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, China, Russia, Eastern Europe, they all allow the growing of industrial hemp. We're about the only industrialized nation out there that does not recognize industrial hemp as being distinct from marijuana. In fact, the UN specifically, under the Single Convention Treaty, which is the drug treaty, specifically recognizes industrial hemp and allows those countries to grow it. So it's clearly been recognized for centuries as being distinct from marijuana, and the U.S. government is the only one that I'm aware of that continues to refuse to accept that.
Bob McGinnis, growing hemp to make the legal under the DEA
well, they provide
products?
many exemptions in here. I think they probably go overboard in trying to accommodate the hemp industry, and that's just the reality. They make some assumptions that you're using a hemp soap, that it's not going to go into the skin. Now, of course, if the science, and they haven't done the science, if the science finds out that it does penetrate the skin and it is beginning to be accumulated in your brain, then maybe they may reverse that. Interestingly, in the European Union, they subsidize hemp growth, just because it's not a very competitive crop. In this country, we could not compete. And in fact, if you were to have all the hemp consumed by this country, it would only occupy a few farmers. So this is not going to be a boon for agriculture.
Okay, Henderson, Tennessee, on our hemp legalization line. Good morning.
Yeah, I'm calling saying that I know I live in a rural part of West Tennessee, and here they have like pine plantations, and I mean they just completely cut them down, but they're on like a 20-year cycle. Where if the farmers were able to plant this for a fiber type crop, I mean they would have a yearly crop, and there's a lot of idle land here that is basically the government's paying for this land just to sit here idle, and then some type of a CRP program or whatever, and this would encourage the farmers, even the smaller ones, because here there's not a lot of really huge farms. They're mainly smaller farms. But those subsidies, and that does tie into this too, is the subsidies would be cut out some, and this could be grown in its place.
Okay, caller, thanks. Eric Steenstra, you want to?
Yeah, it's a really good point. In fact, 13 different states have passed legislation regarding industrial hemp. I've got a list here if you're interested in putting it up on the screen. There's been quite a bit of interest. Hundreds of legislators across the country have seen this, have looked at the issue, the controversy, and decided that it makes sense for their state. They've passed resolutions telling the Congress and the DEA, federal officials, that they want to see the government allow the states to look into this. The way the government treats the states right now is that they don't have the authority or the ability to make this decision on their own. And in addition to that, I'll point out that 22 members of Congress sent a letter to the DEA specifically asking that they relook at this policy regarding industrial hemp food products, saying that it was unreasonable, and even pointed out that the Justice Department sent a letter to DEA saying that these products were clearly exempted and that they weren't being used as drugs or intended that way.
These are the food products you're
That's
talking
correct.
about. Is this the Justice Department saying that they ought to be exempt?
Right. The quote is here in the letter.
Probably we don't want to read that whole quote, but the idea is that basically Justice Department telling DEA, hey, Bob McGinnis?
It's interesting that Canada, who's legalized in '98, has found a significant reduction in the number of acres that are being used in hemp. In fact, they're having a difficult time selling the product after reducing the volume. Back in 2000, USDA did its own study on hemp. And it came up and said, look, this is only a niche market. It's not going to provide any answer or alternative to cotton, like the gentleman from West Tennessee, where they grow a lot of cotton. It's not going to be terribly profitable for more than a couple of farmers at best. And so there are other issues that have to be considered, such as food safety, such as the impact on the culture. So these are things that, clearly Washington politicians have to deal with, and obviously the courts, and many of Eric's protégés are going to try to get the courts to persuade the DEA.
Malden, Massachusetts, anti-legalization line. Good morning.
Good morning.
Go right ahead, caller. You're on the air.
Yeah, I think it's really a moot point here because if you're talking about food and tortilla chips, I can see a time in the near future where Mr. McGinnis would probably trade a month's salary for those tortilla chips because we're going to have food shortages, famines, and both of the speakers here probably get nice fat salaries to present their point. And, let's start. It's about control here, really. It's about the government telling us what we can eat, what we cannot eat, what we can grow, what we cannot grow. Pretty soon, water will be worth more than gold. It says it in the Bible. Thank you very much.
All about control?
Yeah, he's right. There are hundreds of things that we don't let people in America use. We don't let people drive the wrong way on certain streets. We don't let people without training fly airplanes. So, that's the purpose and part of government is to protect the rest of civilization. So we've determined that there are cocaine, heroin, THC is bad for ingestion except under certain circumstances, and that's where a doctor's involved who has many years of training to help, healing process. So, it's an interesting point, but I think non-germane.
Our next call, Portland, Oregon, on the hemp legalization line. Good morning.
Yes, I'd like to address the gentleman who just said that the government is here to protect citizens from ingesting things that are bad for the citizenry. And I just have to laugh about the whole topic of alcohol and how alcohol has wreaked havoc on this society. It's wreaked havoc on the family. It's caused billions and billions of dollars in health care due to people that have abused it. It's caused billions in industry from people calling in sick and being addicted. And I know several people in my life and throughout my life who have smoked marijuana, and it just doesn't seem to be as caustic of a drug as alcohol. And I don't understand why the stigma is there with alcohol, with marijuana.
Okay, caller, thanks.
I'm certainly not going to defend alcohol or tobacco. They clearly kill millions of Americans. But the reality is, and the logic is, just because you have two bad substances that are legal out there doesn't mean you have to keep piling on additional ones that are going to sap our social services and are going to sap more American lives. So we have to draw a line somewhere. It's like we have the FAA out there to control the airlines and to control the airways. If anybody could fly anywhere, anytime, we would have mass chaos. We have to have some regulations for the good of all of us. And so, and anecdotes, quite frankly, just because someone out there that happens to have smoked marijuana for 1,000 years and hasn't had any detrimental impact, that sort of evidence isn't going to be very useful, and that's certainly not something that the DEA is going to listen to, but scientists need to be involved here, and we need to go back to food safety. We need to find out the truth.
Eric Steenstra, give us a roadmap. What should we be looking for, either in the courts or in the Congress, or what? What's going to happen next?
Well, the Ninth Circuit has heard all the DEA and the hemp industry have issued all their filings in the case, and the court's heard oral arguments. We expect to have a ruling in 2 to 6 months, something like that, depending, whenever the court's ready. Like I said, we anticipate that the court will rule in our favor. We believe that the merits are on our side. And then we'll have to just see what the DEA decides to do and what the court says on the issue, whether they issue an opinion or whether, how it comes down.
Now, I would imagine that no matter who wins, somebody's going to appeal it.
Well, that's certainly we would appeal if we did not win, and I would assume maybe that the government would do the same. The next step would be the Supreme Court.
And in the meantime, products that are out there that contain hemp, right now they can be legally sold. Do you expect that will continue to be the case for the rest of this year?
Yeah, the court granted a stay, and in order for the court to grant a stay, they had to look carefully at all the arguments, and they had to determine that there was merit to the arguments and that we were likely to prevail on those merits, and that there was going to be irreparable harm to the industry if they didn't issue the stay. So we feel confident about that.
Got a quick one. We got one more call, and we're almost out of time.
The decision is going to be made on legal procedural terms, not on whether or not THC is dangerous to the health of Americans. And so, this is unfortunate. They ought to be called to task. We ought to have the science. We don't have it. And so, this is going to be a big waste of time over the next year and a half. The hemp industry is going to keep selling what they want, and Americans are going to end up on the short end of the stick, not understanding what, if any, safety threat there is to their food.
You sound like a guy who's expecting to lose, and I think you've said that earlier.
I don't expect the Ninth Circuit to come in favor. However, I think the Supreme Court will see the rationality, much like they did the case out of the Cannabis Buyers Club last year.
Let's get our last word in on this from our callers. Woonsocket, Rhode Island, on the anti-legalization line. You're our last call. Good morning.
Yes, I think both men have good points, but I'm an old smoker, and I know that it has bad effects. It's taken me 25 years to realize that I want to get off of it. And as any person knows, you can take hemp, boil it down, and make a higher active THC in it. You can nod your head all you want. You can take a low-grade hemp, boil it, cook it, and make what they call hemp oil, and it's a teaspoonful. You can make enough to last a weekend. Shake your head all you want there, sir. I know what I'm talking about. I'm no scientist, but I do believe there are good points for hemp and bad points for hemp. But as the other gentleman says, there needs to be more scientific data. And I think it's a great idea because there are going to be these resources that are going to be needed. But do we know it's hemp for sure, or do we not? I don't think so. I don't think there's enough research. Sure, you can make clothes. Well, when we need clothes, we'll go to hemp. Right now, Levi's makes great jeans, and they serve.
And they make them out of hemp too.
Okay, caller.
I know that too. You're right.
We're out of time here. Let's get an answer from Eric Steenstra. Go right ahead.
Well, this argument's just not true. First off, hemp oil is the oil that comes from the hemp seed, not some kind of a drug. And the amount of THC that's in there, like I said, is infinitesimal. And as far as cooking it down, there's no hemp products that are on the market that have any quantity of THC that's going to be cooked down into any kind of drug component. There's no evidence, and the DEA did not present any evidence or even claim that these products are a health danger to the public. Mr. McGinnis keeps claiming that there's some kind of health or safety risk. We've not seen any evidence to support that claim, and in fact, we've done our own studies, and there's been additional studies that have been done. There's no evidence yet that's been presented to show that there's any kind of health risks from these products.
Eric Steenstra, president of Vote Hemp, and Bob McGinnis, who is vice president for policy from the Family Research Council. Thanks to both of you for coming in. Very lively discussion. Appreciate it. I want to let our viewers and our listeners know that in just a few minutes we're going to come back with our second question to you this morning. We're going to talk about the trial of Zacarias Moussaoui, who is the indicted now, supposedly the 20th hijacker who didn't make it onto a plane. Let me just read you a quick thing here so you can think about this question. Without a proper defense and with no assurance of decorum, officials fear the trial of Moussaoui could become a public relations debacle for the administration, which had hoped the case would showcase the fairness and integrity of the American legal system. We'll read more. This is an article in the Baltimore Sun. There's an editorial in the Washington Post. We'll talk about that, get your reaction. Also, in about a half an hour, about 35 minutes, we'll be talking with Herbert Romerstein, I beg your pardon, co-author of The Venona Secrets, Exposing Soviet Espionage and America's Traitors, all about counter-Soviet counter-espionage during the Cold War. We'll be right back.
And now the Mother Teresa of American television journalism.
Tonight on American Perspectives, CNN's Judy Woodruff is roasted by her colleagues and receives the Excellence in Journalism Award. President and Mrs. Bush present the National Arts and Humanities Awards, with ceremonial highlights including a musical duet by Yo-Yo Ma and National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. And later, a tribute to House Speaker Dennis Hastert by his fellow alumni of Wheaton College. American Perspectives, tonight at 8 Eastern and Pacific on C-SPAN.
Book TV's In Depth with Bell Hooks. 3 hours of live conversation, Sunday, May 5th, starting at noon Eastern. Call in to talk with the writer of Ain't I a Woman and Communion, The Female Search for Love. Hear Bell Hooks talk about killing rage, ending racism, feminist theory from margin to center, where we stand, class matters, and Happy to be Nappy, a book for children. In Depth with Bell Hooks, live Sunday, May 5th at noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. Only on Book TV. Only on C-SPAN 2.
Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back to Washington Journal. For about the next 30 minutes, we want to get your reaction to a story here in the Baltimore Sun. We're also going to take a look at an editorial in the Washington Post. The topic is the trial in federal court in Alexandria, I believe it is, Alexandria, Virginia, right across the river from Washington, of Zacarias Moussaoui. He's a citizen of France. He's accused of playing a role in planning the September 11th terrorist attacks. He's under indictment for being, in effect, the 20th hijacker. There were 19 who were on the airplanes that crashed into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and into a field in rural Pennsylvania on September 11th. Mr. Moussaoui is being charged with being part of that conspiracy. Here's the story Laura Sullivan writes in the Baltimore